History is often written in the ink of treaties, the blood of battlefields, and the biographies of kings. Sometimes, the greatest architect of human progress is an apocalypse. In the middle of the 14th century, a shadow fell across the known world. The Black Death liquidated perhaps half of the population of Europe. But if we view this event through the cold, dispassionate lens of economics, Europe in the early 1300s was a society trapped in amber. The medieval mind viewed society as a divinely ordained hierarchy. Below them, crushing the earth beneath their feet, were the masses. At the pinnacle sat the landed aristocracy and the church, holding a near total monopoly on the single most valuable asset, Carde's land. Land was not just real estate. It was the sole engine of wealth, sustenance, and political legitimacy. Below them, crushing the earth beneath their feet, were the masses. The vast majority of them serfs. A serf was not technically a slave, but this was a distinction without much difference. They were tied to the land. If the land changed hands, the serfs went with it. Like the trees or the stones in the field, they were human capital in its most literal sense. Economically, the pre-plague world was defined by a brutal reality, an oversupply of humanity. By the year 1300, the continent was bursting at the seams. In economic terms, this meant that labor had almost zero value. If a lord needed a ditch dug, he had thousands of desperate souls clamoring to do it for mere scraps of bread. The machinery that kept this system running was known as manorialism, a sophisticated extraction engine. The lord didn't just own the land, the lord owned the serf's time, their body, and even their legal identity. Consider the life of a typical serf. Their existence was a web of obligations enforced by the lord's private court. First, there was the corvée, a labor duress. A serf owed the lord a specific number of days per week working the lord's land. The manor was a closed-loop monopoly. The serf was forbidden from grinding their grain anywhere but the lord's mill. They had to bake their bread in the lord's oven. At every step, the lord took a cut. If a serf wanted to marry their daughter, they paid a fine called merchet. If a serf died, their family paid a death tax, often their best animal. Crucially, this was a non-market economy. A serf couldn't simply quit and move to the city. They were legally bound fugitives the moment they stepped off the lord's estate. The arrival of Yersinia Pestis moved along the trade routes, the arteries of medieval commerce. From the ports of Italy, it spread north and west, moving faster than any army. Contemporary chroniclers described an apocalypse, for to visit one another was to catch death. The immediate impact was total paralysis. Production stopped. Fields lay fallow. Trade ceased. Estimates vary, but it is conservative to say that between 1347 and 1351, upwards of 40% of Europe's population perished. This was the moment the economic gravity shifted. Land was scarce and labor was abundant. That truth inverted. Imagine the terrifying realization of a landed noble. Manors stood empty. But without serfs to plow, plant, and harvest, what is that land actually worth? Nothing. For the surviving peasant, however, the world had miraculously opened up. The immediate aftermath of the plague, years, was a period of chaotic economic negotiation that verged on class warfare. Lords, desperate to get their harvests in before they rotted, began poaching each other's laborers. They offered illegal incentives, cash wages, better food, freedom from manorial dues. Wages exploded. In England, the daily wage for an agricultural laborer doubled quickly after the Black Death, and then continued to rise. A carpenter who might have earned 2 pence a day before the plague could now demand 4 or 5. The serf, previously bound to the soil, realized that if his lord wouldn't pay, the lord in the next valley would. The psychological chains of serfdom were breaking. The mobility of labor had begun. The ruling classes did not take this lying down. They viewed this new economic reality not as market forces at work, but as a moral outrage, an upturning of the divine order where the foot was daring to tell the head what to do. Across Europe, kings and parliaments passed emergency legislation to try and turn back the clock. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 was enacted. It was perhaps history's first attempt at comprehensive wage versus price controls. It legally mandated that everyone under the age of 60 must work, and it set wages back at pre-plague levels, making it a crime to demand more or pay more. It was an attempt to legislate economic gravity out of existence. It failed spectacularly. You cannot arrest the free market when the market is fighting for basic survival. When the elites tried to enforce these laws with fines and branding irons, the economic tension exploded into political violence. The decades following the Black Death saw massive uprisings, the Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. These were not just riots. They were articulate demands for an end to serfdom, fueled by the newfound economic power of the laborer. The old system was dying, and it was violent. The elite eventually realized they could not force the genie back into the bottle. They had to adapt to a high-wage economy. This forced a massive restructuring of the European economy. Landlords shifted away from labor-intensive farming like cereal crops, which required armies of peasants to plow and harvest. Instead, they turned to land-intensive, labor-sparse industries. Sheep farming for wool became the new gold mine. It required vast acreage, but only a few shepherds and their dogs to manage thousands of animals. The landed nobility survived, but they changed from feudal lords into agricultural capitalists, managing assets rather than ruling subjects. But the most profound change was among the survivors. For the first time in history, the common person had disposable income. Before the plague, the peasants spent nearly 100% of their energy just staying alive. Now, with wages up and land rents down, they had surplus. They began to eat better, more meat, dairy, and fish, replacing the endless drudgery of bread and pottage. They bought better clothing, stimulating the textile trades in the cities. They improved their homes. This rise in consumer demand from the bottom up created a positive feedback loop, stimulating urban growth and merchant activity. A new group emerged, the yeomanry, in England, independent, farmers who owned or leased substantial land, and answered to no manor court. They were not rich, but they were not poor. They were the embryonic ancestors of the modern middle class, a group defined not by birthright, but by economic function. The Black Death proved a terrifying economic truth. When people are rare, people are valuable. When they are abundant, they are cheap. The birth of the middle class was not a gift from enlightened philosophers or benevolent kings. It was paid for with the lives of half a continent. The freedoms and economic leverage enjoyed by the average worker today have their distant roots in the silent fields and empty workshops of the 14th century, where the surviving few looked at their masters and realized the power balance had shifted. History teaches us that systems of power rarely reform themselves willingly. They only bend when they break, and sometimes it takes a catastrophe to break them. The question that haunts the financial historian is this: is true structural change only possible in the shadow of disaster,